Okay, so I appreciate the honor of having this position. I would say it's a very difficult job to summarize everything, but it's actually a very easy job because people said everything. So pretty much what I put up here, very few of these things are my own thoughts. I've been carefully taking notes. And I'd say the easiest part of my job is thanking Reinhardt. I think I would characterize him with the words modest determination, right? As you all know, he's very self-effacing and is one of the people who gets more done in this world than anyone I've met. So it's been a pleasure working with you and an honor. However, if you look at his last name, embedded within that are the letters A-H-A-B, Ahab. And I'm kind of feeling like this, those of you who are not familiar with Moby Dick, that we may actually be the crew of the Pequod in pursuit of Moby Dick. And at the end of it, well, let me say it did not end well. And I had figured out who is who, but I am Ishmael.
I hope Gary's the whale. He's not here, so I can.
I did not pick a person for the whale. That was a little harsh, but I did have several other characters figured out. Okay, so I wanted to say a really short word about some of the stuff we've been working on, just since everyone else got to talk about their stuff. And I will admit we have a lot less sophisticated work, but this is something that's mystified me for a few years, and maybe there's an explanation for it. So I'm working for a long time with a close colleague on cystic fibrosis at the University of Utah. He's the director of our adult center. And cystic fibrosis is a very well-studied disease. There's a CF foundation that tracks the large majority of people with CF in this country. Very good data in some sense, terrible data in some other senses that I don't really have time to go into. In some ways, it's a very simple disease. That is, it really is single gene, right? There was a huge study done to find another gene, and they found TGF-beta had some tiny effect. It's a single gene disease, but it's a dynamical system, and this is what I'm interested in, between infection, inflammation, and lung damage, right? And those things all affect each other. What's quite striking is FEV1% is just a measure of how much air you can blast out of your lungs in 1 second, and it is an incredibly good predictor of survivorship. So we got into the business of sort of expanding the use of this to build a survival model to say who should get transplanted, which got us into a surprising amount of hot water. And one of the things I learned from that was physicians don't follow the rules, right? So I thought, had some great recommendations. Physicians always know better. Oh, here's one now. So that was a certain amount of the hot water. But the remarkable thing is this predictor of survivorship, which is incredibly good at that, is itself not predictable. And the example is the idea of fast decliners, right? So people would look at the trajectory of FEV1, which is quite noisy because it's affected by all kinds of things. And some people looked like they were going down faster. So that would tell you that they were in bad shape. Some were not going down as fast. But if you took the data and said, if we take the first half of the data, predict the second half of the data, there was basically an R-squared of 0. So no predictive ability. This is a phenomenon that mystifies me, right? It's very predictive of survivorship, but itself not predictable. And we've run into a similar phenomenon and looking at, in a way, a similar data set on CA-125, which is a reasonably good marker of ovarian cancer progression. Predictive of survivorship, not nearly as good as FEV1, and itself not predictable. And so I think there's a mystery there, and I'm kind of thinking that the more in-depth models that people here work with might be the tool to understand where's the predictability, where's the unpredictability in this system. So that's just for my own stuff. Okay, so the rest of this are things that... Oh, sure. Talking about CF. I like talking about CF. Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. Yeah, I just have this feeling there's some deep mystery here about the world, right? So, you know, and FEV1 isn't just a biomarker the way CA-125 probably is, right? It's a real measure of how you feel. You feel terrible when that number is sufficiently low. So it's a real thing, but I don't quite understand why it's not predictable.
What about DLCO?
LCO being?
The diffusion capacity of carbon monoxide, like...
Oh, right. Well, see, we don't have all the data. So that's the interesting thing. The foundation is great at collecting stuff, but what we have is rather limited.
I'm surprised because a pulmonary function test should I would have,
Yeah,
I would
it
have thought
may
you would
be-
have had both of those measures because we look at both of those in IPF. But
Okay, yeah, to be honest, we haven't. I trusted my colleague to tell me as well as what to look at. We've looked at other things like FVC and other things, and they were not nearly as predictive, but I didn't, I will ask him. Thank you.
And just one more thing, Gary's been sort of hemming and hawing at us about having a universal core for some processes. So what you're suggesting here is that there is probably some universal issue related to this kind of a program. And then there's ones for other diseases as well, but these baseline, there are probably some switch that happens and then you go down one of the paths after that. But it originates from a similar program. Gary, you can say it better than I do, probably.
I don't know.
Good point.
I'm sorry, I came in late.
So yeah, I was just insulting you. I mean, CF is an interesting disease and sort of a nice, and a nice disease to work on. It's a great patient population, but also until recently, the patients, unfortunately, were very young, and so they're much more homogeneous. And so it's many of the heterogeneity issues that we've talked about maybe are not as important to deal with here. Okay, so I've broken this up into issues and themes. They're really the same thing, but the issues are sort of things on my mind before I got here, and themes are things that have really come out of my notes. And so the first issue, and this is really where I come from, is the mechanistic details and what I call beyond the central dogma, which is kind of the theme for, I would say, in some sense, for my department at the University of Utah. And just as an example, one of my young colleagues there works on this cool system, which is phenotypic plasticity in a nematode. So it can develop these two different jaw forms. And he plunges in, intense biochemical detail and runs across some gene, HDAC5, histone deacetylase 5, which is not a histone deacetylase. Nobody knows what it does, but it's just called that, unfortunately. And he is in there and is going to spend the next 5 years probably, figuring out what this does. We don't know that level of detail for anything, right? This is a model system chosen to understand that level of detail. I love understanding that level of detail. And this theme of beyond the central dogma, which has been alluded to, is everything in your cell has feedbacks to modify, like small interfering RNAs of various sorts are mucking around with everything. That's why single cell RNA-seq is so noisy. Right, so the fact that everything is feeding, the genes aren't doing anything, there's this whole layer of feedback beyond that, makes it really challenging to get into the mind of a cell. Okay, I love these mechanistic details, but it feels like there's an infinite regress of them out there. And my colleagues who are in the lab right now, I'm sure, are figuring that stuff out. What we do with it is unclear to me. Secondly, and Paul had a really nice approach to this, is signaling as a language, right? And language to me means many things, but these are the ones that I sort of summarize. It's nonlinear. So if I yell louder, that doesn't make it twice as effective, right? Or softer. Non-additive, which is really crucial, right? And context dependent. And Paul talked about the effective ordering. So if I was smarter, I could say this sentence and then say the same sentence in a different order, and it would mean something completely different. I think cells are in the same world when they speak to each other through their signaling. And so this non-additive one really bugs me, right? So you've got two signals that come in, the effect is not plus between them. It could be almost anything, which is true of words also. I had a very humorous example, which I won't say in public. Okay, so.
Sorry, Fred, I think that's something that's been that is a big trap for all of us. That non-additivity is actually one of the biggest challenges we face. And so I appreciate, because nobody really emphasized it until now. And I think I'd like to just thank you for mentioning it and underline it many, many times. Just even a simple signaling, GRN, you have two signals come in, you have no idea how they combine. And so that's a really important caveat for everything we do. Chris Adabi's done some nice sort of theoretical work on that.
I'll have to find that. Yeah, to me, it's a fascinating issue. I mean, at heart, I'm an evolutionary ecologist. I want to understand, or an evolutionary biologist, how things work. Why the signaling language is structured in this way is a really interesting question to me. It could all just be an accident, or there could be some sort of design or adaptive feature to it that creates some kind of robustness. I would love to understand that. The next point, which somebody emphasized, I'm not going to be able to credit everyone for these ideas, but they really are just poached from you guys, is self-organized systems. This is what I study. That's what in my heart, that's what I care most about as an evolutionary biologist, is understanding how self-organized systems work, like this, the immune system being a beautiful example of that. And this is what I've worked on my whole life, but one of my colleagues was delivering some rant at dinner about agency. It's like, what is life about? Agency. And I have no idea what he's even talking about. But at some point, it sort of dawned on me that, and somebody had said this, what's really different about us living things from an airplane is that every unit within us is an information processor and decision maker. Right? They all are, and it's a self-organized system with a heck of a lot of those. I think that makes this digital twin concept fundamentally, infinitely harder than it is for a machine where the pieces are specifically designed not to do that, right? Then here's the issues that have been sort of alluded to, but I did want to bring up is ethical issues. I mean, one thing that concerns me is equity. You know, one of the things we see in the world today, sadly, is increasing division between rich and poor, and that leads to increasing division in health outcomes. You know, people like us have the opportunity to get treated for everything, potentially to have digital twins to help us. The poor people in the world are not going to have that. And however, I think there's a real opportunity for this to help address that. We've seen some hints of that. I think that's really exciting. You know, people in many parts of the world who don't have a lot of money do have cell phones, right? And so I think that there's potential for a transformation here. I would love to see us think about the equity issue. The privacy issue, in a way, I guess I'm less worried since you've said it's fine. I was a little worried about, that's what I call the creepy factor. It's like, you know, your fridge is keeping track of everything you do, your watch, you know, at some point, who cares? But there are concerns about the privacy issue. And I don't tend to like to think about it, but there are probably concerns about hackability into these things and security issues like that. If somebody hacks into your digital twin, it's like, doctor, give him, I don't know, arsenic. That'll cure what's bad for him. Anyway, I'm not so worried about that.
That's happened with pacemakers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there have been attacks on pacemakers.
Okay, well, that's disturbing.
And we have a legal issue, yeah. So
yeah,
this is important as well. So what does it mean? How can we trust in it? And is it a technology which gives advice or things like that? Huh?
That's a great point. Yeah, so these are, of course, things that you who work in this area know a lot more about than I do, but I think it should be central to how we present this. And the last thing, which really is the equity issue in another language, is global change. You know, young people today there's two great issues in our world, right? There's environmental change and there's health, right? And those things are linked. And sort of my central focus in my current role as director of my department is climate and health. How do these two things link to each other? And the theme that I would like to link them through is inflammation. Right? Inflammation is something you see from increased allergens, increased pollutants, increased temperature, increased stress. All of those things go through inflammation. So I'm really committed to trying to build sort of a team to deal with that. You know, and that really just adds another layer to the very nice framework that many of you have laid out, right? There's cells, there's tissues, and there's what's going on outside there. And that matters. And it always bothers me to treat this as isolated from the world around us and all the many stresses we face. So I put that under the ethics categories. So I don't know if we could pause here. So these are sort of things that are really on my mind now. I don't know if anyone has any other comments.
So
Yeah.
do you think there are constraints or boundary conditions or something associated with evolutionary process of selection and fitness, et cetera, regarding the self-organizing systems, right? Because while they may be, you know, multicellular, you know, the fitness function applies to the entire aggregate,
Yes.
right? So there is a certain amount of boundary conditions with respect to individual agency of the components associated with that. And we actually see in cancer a problem when that, you know, aggregate phenotypical, quote unquote, good becomes breaks down and you move back towards colony type behavior. So is there any way you think you can kind of use that to help place boundaries on some of these things?
No, I mean, that's very much is what's on my mind now, right? And people tend to sort of focus on cooperation versus conflict. A lot of this thinking comes out of social insects, but I like to think of it as coordination, right? That is really what your body and what an insect colony is about. Yes, there's conflict everywhere. And you could even think of the competition for resources that we heard about. That's conflict, right? But it's conflict that's part of a coordination system. So to me, it's thinking about breakdown of coordination. So I'm trying to, I'm coming at this from much more the sort of high level theoretical aspect, but that is in a way, a nice way to say the central question I'm interested in, right? How do you maintain coordination and function? I mean, just as an example, having studied ants, I don't know if any of you have spent time watching ants, but ants are complete idiots. You have to have the patience of a saint to follow an ant blundering around like a moron when there's food like right next to it, and they never find it, And it's very zen-like, because once you get into it, you're like, oh, look, she found it and takes it home. Why are they so inefficient? That's a design feature. Right? That's a feature. They are so robust to anything. That's why they can live in the Sahara Desert where nothing else lives, because they're robust to whatever horrible thing happens. They're not optimized, but they're robust. And I think that principle does apply to things like your immune system. It's pretty goofy, in fact, right? No engineer would build the immune system the way it's built, but I'm alive. That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's go on to themes, and this will probably parallel more, Gary, what you put on the board. I can't actually read it from here, but I just go through these, at least the way I put it. So these are things I think that have come up in the discussion a lot. Choose the right problem. In some ways you could say that physics was so successful by choosing the right problem. Planetary orbits, that's not easy, right? One of the greatest insights in human history, but it was the right problem because you'd solve it, right? And so we have to choose our problems. And I think it's based on many things. I've only put a few of them up here. We have to know something about the system. That's what I was sort of asking about, like mental health. I don't think we know enough to write these kind of models for mental health right now. We have to have the data, which is not exactly the same thing. I think this knowledge and that knowledge are kind of closer things, right? Understand some mechanisms, be able to measure stuff. We have to define goals that are actionable, right? And I think many of the examples here have really moved the needle in me. I'm starting to believe that, I don't like the word digital twin, but there's a lot more to be done here than I appreciated 2 days ago. Then there's build the right model. And I've put on just a few buzzwords that have come up many times, which are good buzzwords. What's the level of complexity? How is this model going to be transferable? Modularity, obviously essential for these things to function, extendable, scalable, all these ABLE words, very militaristic. I was trying to use language that would appeal to the DoD here, yeah. And one issue that a few of us have discussed, and Steve and I were talking about, is should there be one model to rule them all, or a suite of models? And I think there should be a suite of models. And however, there's a coordination among them should be achievable. I don't know how that is. That sort of comes up below here. Okay. Data, so a lot of discussion of the kind of data we need. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to summarize everything here, but we have to integrate with the mathematical models and also with model systems like mice and in vitro systems. Reproducibility crisis is, to me, a major issue. It's like somebody measures something in a mouse and somebody else measures it in the mouse and they get different results. Well, what do we do with that? This issue of baselines was very appealing to me. I played a bass, and I was very excited that people were talking about baselines. And then I realized this was spelled differently. But these baselines, this is something that I think is essential for understanding disease states. And we don't do a very good job of that, actually, like in cancer. Validation criteria are really an interesting issue that and James has emphasized really nicely. Like, looks kind of good, or even you get a good fit. What does that really mean? Something I don't think that's been emphasized that much is missing or biased data here. Certainly when we deal with the CFFPR, the CF database, there's all these missing data in there. Do you impute them, ignore them? What do you do with missing data? Very annoying issue, and super annoying issue in my limited experience when it's a large data set. And it's just really hard to start imputing things. I hate imputing data, but you don't want to throw them out also. So bias data is something I don't think we've talked about much, but so just as an example, people get tested for COVID when they have symptoms. People are going to show up at biased times. Well, we're not getting a random sample of what the world looks like. And that's true of individuals. Even if you follow somebody over time, you're not getting an unbiased view of their world. And the other example of this, and this is a real challenge we see with CF, built this building. Is this your building? Oh, that explains so many things. Okay, problem solved. I won't lean on that again. Is this treatment problem, right? So if you ask who dies of infectious diseases or of bacteria, people who take antibiotics, right? Looks pretty bad, right? So breaking that causal arrow is a real problem for us with CF or with some of the other diseases like cancer. It's like, oh, this treatment's not working. Well, the treatment was chosen by a physician for a reason, and therefore it's not a randomized treatment. So that creates, as far as I can know, biases that are really hard to get around. Stochasticity by various names has come up quite a bit. I'm really interested in this issue of limits to predictability, which I think is at the core to me of sort of the problem, one of the challenges in this area. Uncertainty quantification is a really nice approach that I've just started learning a little bit about. And one thing that was mentioned in terms of patient-derived organoids is experiments on patients, which I really like, right? If you're going to get insight into what the dynamics of a system, you want to be able to manipulate it. So that at least is an ethical way to do experiments on patients. But in certain circumstances, I think, and doctors do this, right? It's like, I've had this chronic cough, which is better here because it's human. A doctor's like, try this. She's doing an experiment on me, right? It didn't work. I got worse, but it was a useful experiment. I'm not taking that stuff. So, but I think we should think carefully about whether or not that's an appropriate way to get more information on patients. Here's something I tend to avoid. This is reality. And so this adherence question is interesting from the perspective of both patients and physicians. So in CF, there are drugs. I didn't talk about the new drugs, which are great. These new drugs, some people, you feel lousy like 12 hours after stop taking your drug, and some people still don't take them. It's insane, right? So adherence to what we, experts recommend is really a challenge. And as we saw, as I mentioned in the CF thing also, adherence by physicians to recommendations is very idiosyncratic. And I respect physicians. I think they know a lot about what they're doing, but it means that we've got to be sort of more humble about it. The understanding issue is just if we have some sort of modeling system, people have to understand it, right? And so these nice interfaces we've heard about are a great idea. This issue of the randomized controlled trial gold standard has certainly been a challenge for us in thinking about cystic fibrosis. It's like setting up a randomized controlled trial costs a heck of a lot of money. You better know what you're doing. But at the end of the game, I still think that those are going to be the gold standards. So we have to work with our models to make sure that we do the right trials and get the most information out of them by choosing the right arms, using the models to choose the right doses or range of dose, the whole thing. I mentioned the good interface thing. This clear objective and the metrics has come up many times, right? People really have to know what we're getting at. I think if you're like, I have a model of blah, 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 nobody cares. But you're like, I want to help you with your MS. People will care, right? And the good metrics, like you're walking better. I really like this point about the stepwise rollout. That was really nice. We heard about beta test versions and so forth. We don't huddle in our Frankenstein-like basement waiting to deliver the monster. We can deliver the alpha version and the beta version of the monster, and people are like, that's pretty cool. And I don't know what response time is. Oh yeah, just that if you have this thing, it's got to be useful in a useful amount of time. It's not like, run it for 7 hours or 7 days and it'll come back. Okay, so that's reality. The training issue, I'm glad, came up several times. I thought some really good points about this. So we've trained students, but in a way, maybe more importantly, training ourselves. And there's these books like How to Do Team Science. I've never read them. I believe I know what I'm doing, but I probably don't. But I think we're really going to have to build an infrastructure. This is a very diverse group of people. None of us can do all of this. Well, maybe Tom, the one who left, can do it on his own. I can't, so this question of the all-knowing PI, I think, is going to be a real challenge, right? I mean, look around this room. Some people are pretty amazing how much they know, but can you do everything? I don't know. And if there isn't, I mean, this gets back to self-organized systems in a way. If there's not a single all-knowing PI, how can this system even run, right? Where does the buck stop when a problem arises? Okay, so just to finish off the name, right? So we've got delirium, not delirium tremens. This is digital twins. Sorry about that. The digital partners, that was very friendly. I like that. I thought that was better. And then I was thinking about, I don't like either the word digital or twin, which it doesn't matter at all. So I was thinking, what are these things really? They're adaptive models, but they're really personalized adaptive models, right? But they're built on our understanding from over there. So I think of them as scientific, personalized adaptive models. So that's my proposed name, right? It gets at I think it gets at all the elements. These are models, right? They're built on models. They adapt because we're sharing data. They're personalized because the data are individual. I'm hoping this fits with your diagram over here. I don't know. And they're built on some mechanistic understanding as opposed to something that's been discussed remarkably little here, to my delight, machine learning and AI, right? These are what I like to do, science. So anyway, that's my proposed name, which I know will be voted down swiftly like every other name I propose.
1937. After dinner, I looked it up.
Oh, you looked it up?
1937.
Oh, interesting.
There was a pork shoulder surplus in the United States, and the government got them to make it into something people would eat.
That is really cool.
It's
Allegedly, what human tastes like.
it's a very good abbreviation. It's spam.
Exactly. It's spam. So that took me a little while to come up with that. Okay, that is all I have to say.
So this is great. Thank you, Fred. So let's maybe what we could do now is do a Q&A with you on
Sure.
on this for starters.
Okay.
And then I think this is sort of a natural transition into the next part of this, and that's to talk about what are funding mechanisms that we need? How do you fund these kinds of projects? They're not R01 projects, right? Or single PI projects. So the floor is open. Gary.
All right. So as you know, as you've heard me talk about for the last year and a half, I hate the term too, right? The problem is that people use the term, right? And so I think as much as we would like to call it something else, the unfortunate fact of the matter is that this is the term that is hot at the moment. And I think if we are going to use that as an opportunity to put forth our particular agenda into how we envision these things to be and how they can be used, I think we're kind of stuck with this term that is at some level, the ostensible reason for the existence of this particular conference and this particular group. I agree with you. I hate it, but there are pragmatic reasons why I think we need to use it.
I'm not going to personally, I have no power in this universe. I'm not going to fight that fight. But it is true that the CDC, like a month ago, declared monkeypox as Mpox. We'll see how well that goes over. So names of things have changed. And if it's a high priority, my only concern is how similar it is to the name of these things in industry. And I think it's fundamentally different. One could add an adjective here before it, and then I think that would help distinguish it. I don't know what that would be.
So I would agree. I also hate the term, and I have added medical. So in many cases, I call them medical digital twins to separate them. And in particular, it indicates that the situation is different enough that one needs to be careful, for one, about what exactly you mean by this term. It needs to be a bit plastic.
Yeah. No.
But I also agree with Gary that it's a thing for now, and if you change that terminology anyway. James.
MDT is Harrisburg Airport.
That's probably not that important.
But no, well, you've been telling jokes. I thought
That
I'd
was the
tell a
most
joke.
obscure piece of knowledge I think I've heard in this room yet, however.
But you made a comment about alpha and beta versions, and perhaps this is so obvious it doesn't need to be said, but just because it's obvious doesn't mean it doesn't need to be said. Which is, if we think about, and the FDA, when they spoke to the working group the other day, I think made this point very clearly, in terms of validation. What are stages? And that's a little bit different from alpha beta release version of the software. The first thing you want to be able to do is post-dict things. You want to be able to predict things. And then when you have some confidence in that, you might do diagnosis. And then you might do, again, offline, not using it. Then you might do prognosis and check offline, not using it. And then when you have confidence that that works in a variety of areas, then you begin to do recommendation, physician-assisted recommendation. Ask the question, which I think you brought up very well, is if you add a mechanistic component to your data method, do you make it better or worse? Sometimes you make it worse. That a little bit like the paradox you brought up here. And then when that works, you begin to gradually give more agency to the model to the event that you eventually get to something like an autopilot. And you brought up the comment about engineered systems trying to avoid this. And my classic disaster example is airplane autopilots on Airbus and now on the Boeing 737 MAX, where when there's a crisis, the autopilot turns off. Which means that just when the plane is about to have a problem, the pilot suddenly has the plane change its behavior totally, which leads to large numbers of Airbuses crashing into the ground. Because you actually change the control system exactly at the time when you shouldn't do it. And so there's an interesting lesson there, perhaps, for how these systems might operate. I'm not sure exactly what lesson to take, but you brought it up as a specific difference. And I think there is a lesson there that could be learned.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I think I liked the idea that these are decision support devices. I think that's the way one's going to get buy-in from users. And I like the fact that people make decisions. And so at least if your physician support device decides to quit because of some, Wizard of Oz-like problem, you're still there to deal with it. But yeah, I guess what I thought was interesting, which once again, I don't know anything about, not having dealt with this, is maybe having people buy into the system, that is physicians, patients, maybe other users, before you go through all those stages you talked about. So I was sort of worried about us being here, perfecting it, and now we're going to roll the thing out and change the world. I'd like to see that roll out, reach out to the public earlier.
And that's, of course, what TELF has been doing. Right?
Exactly. I was very
You're
impressed
starting
by
at the other end.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to bring it up as a question, that you think about how to think of. I wasn't trying to say that you wait till the end of that to try to do what you're doing. I'm just saying that there's a sort of a sequence of you're getting more and more life critical as you go forward. The FDA in their validation has a very sense of standard. The more life critical it is, the more validation you have to do, which is sensible. And so it makes sense that you have these staged rollout, staged development, staged sense of validation and trust. We didn't use the word trust much in this meeting. The VPH people use the word trust a lot. Europeans, I think, use trust a lot as a concept.
So I think there is something to be learned from parts of the ML community where people are talking about doing random clinical trials on those particular methods. And I think as these decision support methods come online, and as Tom from Austin had talked about, right, there is a utility assessment that would be made in a prospective controlled fashion, because as you said, RCTs are the gold standard. Admitted what the limitations are, phase, 4 trials and non-transferability and all these other sorts of things. The fact of the matter is the best thing we have is an RCT, right? And it's not unreasonable to expect that the decision support capabilities by clinically deployable MDTs should go through some sort of clinical assessment. and to be at some level positive and negative, right? One of the most notable sepsis prediction AI systems, the TRUE system out of Boston, right, which showed a clinical benefit of having that system available. Doesn't say you have to use it, just that it's available, right? Produced a statistically significant improvement in outcomes regarding sepsis, 6% improvement, right? In actuality, the system is terrible at predicting sepsis, right? And the thing that it actually did was it gave people antibiotics 1 hour earlier on average, right? The system is bad, but it provides an outcome benefit. The problem with that is there's no cost function associated with giving all those people antibiotics, which you need to deal with. That's a separate issue. But these types of decision support systems, when I have seen them been trialed, it's just like, it's over here in the corner. I'm not telling you to use it, right? It's just there if you want it. And that availability is kind of like the first pass regarding, whether or not it might have an impact.
Stephen.
So I have a couple of thoughts that I think they're related, but I just haven't quite got the link yet. So one is that if the gold standard is going to be an RCT of a system, and you're talking about a 5-year program, I don't think we've got anything near ready to go to trial in time to get to that point. The other thing is that there are uses of these systems that are not patient-facing, and they're not even clinician-facing. It's for the researchers themselves.
Yeah.
So maybe what we can do is use a 5-year program to extend our 15-minute chance to prove to ourselves that these are very useful systems that can help us develop better things, so that at the end of 5 years, we'll be able to go to a funding agency and say, this is our specific set of goals, and we know how to get there. And by the end of the next 5 years, we'll be doing RCTs on it.
So, I'm sorry. I just need to answer that because at some level, I completely agree. But this is where we need to somehow adopt the language of the moment, right? In terms of populations of digital twins, because this question of using virtual in silico trials for candidate discovery, candidate evaluation, this is not new, right? And it is not actually sexy enough, right, to capture this particular wave, right? So if we're going to do that, which I think we absolutely positively should, and this is where I think these types of objects have the most potential use moving forward to the thing that you actually want to do, which is to find new drugs that work, right? It needs to be cast in a way that has some tie back to some clinical population, even though you're not trialing a particular intervention on that particular population, but it can't just be a population that exists in this ether of possibility, right? There needs to be some tie, right, in how those model populations are generated to some real clinical cohort of which real world data can be obtained.
Paul.
So, thinking to, the design of the trial, first of all, it seems like we need to be, tying to it, not just, the tool we're going to try, but if we're calling it clinical decision support, part of the trial design needs to be what decision are we supporting? So it's a little bit more testable other than it was in the room. So I think we need, that needs to be a really well thought out part of the design of the trials. What specific decisions are being supported and perhaps encouraged by the outputs of this tool? So that's one thing. And the other thing is I think we could move towards a kind of a quasi-live trial, right? Where you can imagine, not in this case enrolling patients, but actually enrolling doctors and past accumulated data saying, imagine that this data comes in front of you and now we try the tool on it. What would you have done without the tool versus the tool, and then chart the two outcomes? I mean, is that at all possible for prior data?
It's going to give you garbage information.
It's going to be what?
It's going to give you garbage information because, as was noted, we don't know what the hell we're doing anyway, right? So even in the real world, to a great degree, there's a huge amount of just gestalt for why you choose one particular thing versus another particular thing. It's not formalized in any sort of way. And if you give me another piece of information, it's a hypothetical. I don't know how useful that's going to be. And I, as a clinician who even thinks about this, I know that the vast majority of my clinician colleagues don't think about it.
Because you could imagine a trial where you say control group does standard of care, whatever that means, and effect arm says use the decision tool to alter your decision. First of all, was there even a detectable difference in what decisions they would have made with that clinical decision support tool?
Hang on, folks.
I'm sorry. I just need to answer this.
I appreciate it.
People who have looked at compliance of physicians to well-described evidence-based guidelines for therapy. Compliance is terrible, right? Even for things that have been proven by the best of evidence medicine, sepsis guideline treatment, it's terrible. So I think we're operating as your delta. That's not going to work.
Reinhard, I think Paul mainly already said what I was going to say. The only thing I can add is that our goal is not only to find new drugs, Gary. That's as you said. I think clinical decision support can, for example, be, the goal can be to repurpose existing drugs or make better decisions with whatever tools we have available already. So not to diminish the importance of finding new drugs, but that's not the only goal.
Right. And clearly you want to optimize what you can. I would argue that in certain circumstances, drug repurposing is analogous to finding new drugs because you're applying them in a context you otherwise have. So no question that you need to optimize, no question that decisions need to be made better. There's no question about that. But no physician would say, I wish I didn't have a better drug for something, right? No one's going to say that. And we have an entire biomedical research community that's focused on doing that. And we have an entire industry that's focused on doing that as well.
Go ahead.
I guess one thing, thinking about compliance for physicians, how feasible is it when you run these models and come up with, the decision that the model would predict, to also provide the information about the variable that put it in that category so that at least the physician would have some idea of why you were getting that description, why you were getting that choice?
So like when we did our original survivorship model to identify the best candidates for transplant with cystic fibrosis, it's a logistic regression, and we chose that, A, because it's the only thing we knew how to do, but B, it gives you a number out, so there's like 7 covariates that go into it. They were all things that physicians were familiar with, and it pops out a number, which is a 5-year survivorship prediction, which has a lot of spread. It really goes from like 5% to 99%. And, it's like people who are below 30% survivorship prediction are predicted to benefit from transplants. I think it was as clear as it possibly could be, and people totally ignored it.